Welcome to the Cyber Rants Podcast, where we're all about sharing the forbidden secrets and slightly embellished truths about corporate cybersecurity programs. We're ranting, we're raving, and we're telling you the stuff that nobody talks about on their fancy website and trade show giveaways, all to protect you from cyber criminals. And now, here's your hosts, Mike Rotondo, Zach Fuller, and Lauro Chavez.
Hello and welcome to the Cyber Rants Podcast. This is your co-host, Zach Fuller, joined by Mike Rotondo and Lauro Chavez. Today we have an excellent episode. We are going to be talking about something that does not get talked about enough, something that we really should dig into a little bit deeper, and that is backup, disaster recovery, especially with all the ransomware and everything that's going on out there. We should talk about this more. This is important, and as a result, we brought in the person they call Mr. Backup himself. W. Curtis Preston is joining us today. Curtis, it's a pleasure to have you on the call.
Happy to be here.
Well, great. We're going to dive in. We'll do some an introduction of Curtis here in just a moment. But Mike, why don't you kick us off today with the news?
Got a lot going on in the news today. Brazen crooks are now posing as cybersecurity companies to trick you into installing malware. Cyber criminals are now posing as cybersecurity companies in phishing messages that claim the recipient has been hit by a cyber attack and that they should urgently respond in order to protect their network. The person receiving the email is provided with an incident case number and is told to call a particular phone number to organize the audit. CrowdStrike describes this as callback phishing because when the victim calls the number, they're connected to an operator who persuade them to install a rat. So be very careful. A spike in Amazon Prime scams expected. Cybersecurity company Avanan has warned of an increase in phishing and credential harvesting email attempts in June in advance of Amazon's Prime Days. I realize Prime Days is over, but still important. It says hackers are using a range of scams to target consumers, including email campaigns that dangle the promise of an Amazon gift card in return for taking a survey. Watch out for CVE 2022-30136 Windows NFS remote code execution flaw. Trend Micro Research has published an analysis of the recently patched Windows vulnerability CVE 2022-30136 that impacts the network file system. The exploit is a remote code execution vulnerability that resides in the Windows network file system. It is due to improper handling of NFS v4 request. A remote attacker can exploit this vulnerability by sending malicious RPC calls to the target server to achieve arbitrary code execution in the context of system. Experts pointed out that the unsuccessful exploitation of this issue may trigger a crash of the impacted system. So even if they don't exploit you, they could crash it. This is exciting for all of us in the DoorDash life. Hackers steal 50,000 credit cards from 300 U.S. restaurants. Payment card details from customers of more than 300 restaurants have been stolen in 2 web skimming campaigns targeting 3 online ordering platforms. Web skimmer or MageCart malware are typically JavaScript code that collects credit card data when online shoppers type it into a checkout page. Recorded Futures threat detection tools identified 2 MageCart campaigns injecting malicious code into the online ordering portals of Menu Drive, Harbor Touch, and InTouch POS. As a result, 50,000 payment cards were stolen and have already been offered for sale on various marketplaces on the dark web. Most of these restaurants are small local establishments across the U.S. using the platform as a cost-effective alternative to outsourcing their online ordering process. On both platforms, a web skimmer was injected into the restaurant's web pages and to assign subdomain on the online payment service platform. The air-gapped system has leaked data via SATA cable Wi-Fi antennas. A security researcher has found a new way to steal data from air-gapped systems by using serial ATA cables present inside most computers as a wireless antenna that sends out data via radio signals. Dubbed Satan, S-A-T-A, lowercase n. The attack was discovered by the head of R&D of the cybersecurity research labs at Ben Gurion University in Israel and can theoretically help an adversary steal sensitive information. For an attack to succeed, an attacker first needs to infect the targeted air-gapped system. While this is not an easy attack, there are reports of physical initial compromises since 2010, Stuxnet being the most notorious one. This piece of malware that is planted on an air-gapped network can target the sensitive information prepared for exfiltration by modulating and encoding it. That's it for the news. I got a couple headlines for you. Tor browsers now bypass internet censorship automatically. Elastic VoIP systems hacked in a massive campaign to install cloud-based cryptocurrency mining attacks have used GitHub Actions and Azure VM. That's a big thing. And then for all of you Honda drivers, hackers can unlock Honda cars remotely, enrolling PWN upon attacks. So something to keep in mind. And lastly, for us business owners, ransomware scourges drives price hikes in cyber insurance. Something to keep in mind. And with that, Laura, what do we got for exploits?
Awesome, Mike. Thanks for that. A lot of good stuff in the news this week. To couple on the Windows NFS flaw, I am seeing quite a few exploits being POC'd on GitHub. So make sure you're looking out for the Microsoft patch, and at least for the compensating control pieces that are going to be necessary to close that flaw. For exploits this week, we just have one. It's a very important one though, because a lot of people out there are using Nginx or Nginx. This is a denial of service for 1.20. Current version is 1.23. So you can tell that some of these actors are using they're essentially taking the resolves for the next version and then reverse engineering a flaw into the previous versions. This is a cleverly done Python script that essentially does localized ARP poisoning with DNS hijacking and doesn't enable the box to basically talk to anything on the network while the script is running. So pretty clever attack here for these Nginx systems. So if you're using Nginx in any capacity of web servers or anything like that for proxy, make sure you're trying to get off of 1.20. These exploits are becoming more common for this common operating system. And with that, Zach, I hear we have a pretty awesome guest this week to talk with, so I'm excited.
We do. Thanks, Laura. In just a moment, we are going to talk with Mr. W. Curtis Preston about backup, disaster recovery, and dive right in, but we'll be right back after a quick commercial break.
Want even more Cyber Rants? Be sure to subscribe to the Cyber Rants podcast. Get your copy of our best-selling book, Cyber Rants, on Amazon today. This podcast is brought to you by Silent Sector, the firm dedicated to building world-class cybersecurity programs for mid-market and emerging companies across the U.S. Silent Sector also provides industry-leading penetration tests and cyber risk assessments. Visit silentsector.com and contact us today.
And we're back with W. Curtis Preston. Curtis, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for jumping on with us, and look forward to this conversation.
Anytime I can talk about backups is a good day for me.
Outstanding. Well, hey, first things first, you've got over 30 years or coming on 30 years in disaster recovery, in the backup space. What got you into that field? Can you give us a little bit about your background and kind of what took you down that path to specialize in that area?
If I'm being honest, what got me into the field was the job I could get. Right. Back in 1993, my wife actually worked for, at that time, what was the second largest credit card corporation, and they needed a backup guy. And, I knew a guy that knew a guy, basically, my wife. I basically leveraged that relationship to get a job as the backup guy at MBNA. And then through a series of, total happenstance, I just never got out of it. I didn't initially plan it that way, but after I'd say about 5 or 6 years, I realized that I had become a specialist in something that everybody else abandons. And so, because it is a job that we often give to the junior person, which is a horrible thing to do, but that's what we do. And then as soon as somebody gets, some seniority, they move on to be a quote unquote real sysadmin. And so once I realized that, then I started writing and publishing. And that's, I think, 99 is when I published my first book.
And you've written 4 books total, correct?
Correct.
Outstanding. First, at a high level, what are the big issues that you're seeing today in the backup and recovery field when these companies are getting hit with ransomware or whatever happens? Right. What are the top problems that you're seeing in the business?
Yeah, it's funny. If you had asked me that question, let's say 10 years ago, I would have said that the top problem was that people didn't understand how their backup infrastructure worked, right? They didn't understand about tape and disk and deduplication and these things. The problems were more sort of throughput related and just getting the backup system to function. Today, and more specifically, well, let's go back. Say 4 or 5 years ago, the answer would have been, well, just make sure your backup system is air gapped, right? That you can have a good copy when you get hit by ransomware. The last 1 to 2 years, the answer is that the primary, I think, challenge for today's backup environments is that backup systems have moved from this unnoticed box in the corner of the data center that no one cares about to victim number one in a ransomware attack. So, especially the Conti ransomware group, because they've actually, it's been made quite public that they specifically target the backup servers. They specifically target certain products, not just vulnerabilities, not so much vulnerabilities in the product itself, but vulnerabilities in the configuration and the installation. And then they exfiltrate the backups and then delete them and then begin their ransomware attack. Right. So backups have moved, like I said, from something that wasn't getting noticed at all to the front lines of the ransomware battle.
What are companies doing differently, or are they doing anything differently nowadays? Are they really are you really seeing them being more proactive, making backup and recovery more front and center in their security programs, or are they still kind of lagging behind?
I'd say it's well, both of those things are happening, right? I mean, you guys fight the cybersecurity war, if you will, all the time. You know that there are 1,000 things that every customer should be doing, and they might be doing a handful of them. I do see a lot of companies looking at their backup system. I also see the vendors responding well. The vendors responding with best practices as to how well the average customer is implementing them. I don't have any insight into how well they're actually doing that. So, not sure if I have a good answer to that question.
Yeah, it's tough to know, of course. What are you seeing, or what would you prescribe? Let's talk about those organizations. We talk to a lot of mid-market, emerging size companies, limited
Mm-hmm.
resources and such. There, a lot of times, unfortunately, the answer is, oh, we're in the cloud, we're good, or there's some there. It's kind of almost an afterthought. What would you prescribe? Is there a series of steps or a methodology that you'd prescribe to these organizations that don't really know where they are in terms of backup and recovery?
Yeah, so I was a consultant for 20 years, right? So the answer to any question like that is it depends, right? So it depends entirely on the backup infrastructure that you use, right? So on one end, you've got, on sort of two ends of the spectrum. On one end, you've got a piece of software that you buy from, pick your favorite backup vendor, and you install it on your box that you're going to manage. On the opposite end, you have a service like the company that I happen to work for, Druva, which is a SaaS-based service that handles all of the cybersecurity aspects for you, right? So in that range, on the opposite end of Druva, the big thing is that I'd say it's a lot like I should really write like a 12-step program, I think, for for people that are looking at their backups, because the first step is you just need to acknowledge that you have a problem, right? Just acknowledge that your backup system, that no one's been paying attention to the cybersecurity aspects of your backup system. So that's the first step, and then we just need to look at the very common risks, the things that, a backup system, the first thing I think that if we're talking about an on-prem system, whether it's the one end of the spectrum where it's a piece of software, in the middle, by the way, are backup appliance companies, right? That provide an appliance that they manage the upgrading of the OS along with the application. So it should not be part of the domain, right? It should be a local password system. you should be using your backup systems, abilities to use the concepts of least privilege. You should be using multi-factor authentication. These are things that you're like, well, these are to guys like you three. You're like, well, duh. But the thing is, we're talking about backup people that are often the most junior people in the data center, and so they're not necessarily the system has gone unnoticed by cybersecurity people. So start applying common um, cybersecurity techniques to your backup system, right? It should be separated and segregated, if you will. You should also, one really big thing is where and how do you store the actual backups? So again, I'll give you two ends of the spectrum. One is if I have a Windows based, it's very common that I'd say the two biggest backup software vendors right now run on Windows based servers. And so it's very common, like a default installation is to install that product and store the backups in a directory called C:\backups. Don't do that. Right? That's bad. And it's not just the fact that it's an incredibly obvious directory. It's that it is sitting directly in and accessible to that backup server as a file, right? That's the first thing that has to happen is this where you're actually physically storing the backups. And let's face it, most people today are storing them on some kind of disk, be it cloud or on-prem disk. If those backups are directly accessible to the backup server as a file, then if that backup server is compromised, I can easily exfiltrate and delete those backups. There are, I won't go into a level of detail there, but there are, depending on your backup product, there is a way to make that happen, right? And if you can't do it for the on-prem copy, you definitely have to have an air-gapped copy that's stored somewhere else. So I think that's a good first handful of steps.
Yeah, we see that a lot with a lot of our smaller clients is that they just use the base install and think, oh, we're good. And it's a standard domain. It's not even local. It's not a separate account. There's very few controls around it. And that's one of the things that's, at least on the CISO operations side, that we definitely address as soon as possible. Dealing with the cloud, I mean, you got your backup stored in the same region as your production and you don't have a backup region. That's a problem too.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you from? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Mike. But are you aware of have you heard of the cloud code spaces attack? This is several years ago.
No, it doesn't ring a bell.
There was actually a company that ran its infrastructure in AWS, and they did everything that they're not supposed to do. Right? They had one account. They did not have MFA enabled. And they had their primary and their backup all in that one account. Yeah. And then they got hacked. And literally the company ceased to exist. And the irony is that they were a SaaS-based service to store other people's code.
Oh,
it was supposed to be a safe place to store your code. So yeah, so so the principles of the 3-2-1 backup, right? Storing data, at least one of the copies in a different location than your primary, it applies in the cloud as much as, if not more than in the data center.
Now, it's been a long time since I've done operational backups. Is it still the prevailing philosophy that you do an incremental daily and then a full every week, and then offload that, store that full for 4 weeks and rinse and repeat?
Yeah. So that is the concept of an occasional full is for most backup products. Well, if we look at current backup products that have come out in the last, I'd say, 10 years, generally they all use an incremental forever approach. Generally speaking, that doesn't work with everything. So, for example, databases, you still often have to do an occasional full backup.
Right.
But the old school, like a weekly full and daily incremental, that generally had to do with tape, because
Right.
if you didn't do that, your restore would be horrible, right?
I'm
Um,
thinking back to being that junior guy sitting in a server room with a box of tapes and a fireproof handheld safe going, hey, here's this tape, here's this tape. Yeah.
yeah, doing a restore with dozens of tapes was always a giant pain. One thing that hasn't changed, there is a core concept of, we call it the 3-2-1 rule.
Mm,
3 copies of your data on 2 different media that have different risk profiles, and one of which is stored off-site. That's
gotcha.
an old, an old thing from the '90s that still rings true.
Right.
Well, here's a question I have. Should for backup resiliency, should there still be a usage of tapes, do you think? I mean, I know it's somewhat looked at as antiquated to have the big silos that, that did all the cool robotics and stuff, but with the attacks that we have today, I mean, just being a crazy idea, would it make sense to bring something like that back?
So so first off, I'll say I am not an anti-tape person, right? I'm probably the most pro-tape person at Druva. Druva being a 100% cloud company, right? We don't have any tape, but so I'm not against tape. I'll say 2 things. One is the biggest challenge with tape is how it works, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how it works. Because most people, if I were to ask the 3 of you, and I won't put you on the spot, if I were to ask you, the 3 of you, what's the primary problem with tape, I'm willing to bet that you would say that it's too slow. And that's what almost every client I ever had thought was wrong with tape. The problem is tape is actually too fast. It's a fundamental mismatch of technology, and people use it because they think it's going too slow, and it's actually going too fast. That that problem still exists. In fact, it's way worse than it was 10 years ago when I was, doing this in the trenches. Having said all of that, I'll just say a short yes to your question. Right? There's nothing wrong with having that. The challenge comes in the logistics of making that happen. Number 1, and number 2, getting that copy to anywhere. If you've moved into the cloud, how exactly do you make a tape copy of your stuff that's in the cloud? If you're in the data center and everybody's working remotely, how do you get that tape sent to somewhere other than that data center? It's more about logistics than anything else. And also, Druva works with customers that have, tens of petabytes. If you've got tens of petabytes, how exactly do you create an occasional full backup of that? The answer is it's just really difficult. So there's nothing wrong with tape per se. I'd say that it's also really good, by the way, at holding on data for really long periods of time. So if you do need an archive that you want to hold on for 10, 15, 20 years, right now, there's not much better options than a LTO tape.
Cool. Thanks for that and for entertaining my my would-be vision of an archaic future that still sees, tapes as a suitable form
But,
of
but
secure cold storage backup.
by the way, more tape is sold today than it was before. There's a whole lot of tape in the cloud. In fact, all of the current hyperscalers are when I talk to the tape companies, they're their biggest customers. So tape isn't gone. What has happened is it's no longer, for most people, being used for backup and recovery. They're using it for long-term storage and for, having an extra copy that, the sort of a doomsday archive copy kind of thing. So it's not as archaic as you might think. How's that?
Awesome. Yeah, I always thought the problem would be, like you said, logistics of just, the recovery from tape, but also, how do you manage, especially where you have older tapes and, an older vendor that's, that uses the tapes, right? The deck essentially, and then have the manufacturer keep up with that. It's equivalent of going out today and trying to find an 8-track player that still works in some cases right off eBay And then
Well,
how do you
yeah.
project that down the road 30 or 40 years, right? Hoping that we'll still have the capability to play like a cassette tape, you know?
Well, I think we have good. There's a good. What do you call it? I mean, it's a valid concern. I had. Do you know what a 9-track tape is? Not
Yeah,
an 8-track.
absolutely.
The old 9-track tapes. Okay,
Sure.
go on eBay. There's like thousands of 9-track drives available for sale right now. And if it's not eBay, there are actual companies who basically refurbish these things. Those are ancient, right? That's from the 50s and the 60s. So there will be LTO drives available 30, 50 years from now. I'm a little, I'm a, I have a current interest there. There's a technology called MDisc. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. That's my current sort of thing that I'm really looking to. It's an optical platform. It looks like a Blu-ray or a DVD, but they changed the substrate. The substrate of DVDs are a dye. It's an organic dye that gets burnt with the laser. The MDisc is it's an inorganic. They call it rock, but obviously it's not a rock, but it's an inorganic layer that they burn with a laser, and they're advertising 1,000-year life. And what's amazing about this relatively new technology, it's like 15 years now, is that it's compatible, it's read compatible in any DVD or Blu-ray drive, depending on which one you're talking about. So I think that's an example of how we can continue moving forward while still having backwards compatibility. So, but that is a real problem that we talk a lot about in backup and archive circles, is that the 100-year data problem that not easy to fix.
Well, I recently worked for a company that, recently, within the last 10 years, worked for a company that had data that went back to the 70s, and they were keeping mainframes alive at $3 billion a month to be able to maintain that data. Because they weren't creative enough to figure out anything else. So,
right.
Data hoarding is definitely a problem as well.
Yeah.
So it'll call a lot of data that you really don't need, and make that determination. And do you get resistance on, or maybe you don't even ever get into the space, but is like, hey, you can get rid of that data. You don't really need it anymore.
Yeah, I'm a subscriber to the Data Hoarders threaded on Reddit. So I am intimately aware with this problem. These are people that proudly hoard their data, and when you hear a home user say, if they're new to the subreddit, they'll log in there like, so I have 150 terabytes of movies. Like, how should I back that up? How should I, you're like, how do you have 150 terabytes of
right?
Right? Have you heard of Netflix? I'm sorry if I've dissed, my
That's the doomsday. That's the doomsday library of movies when there's no more Netflix.
Yeah. But but in a corporate space, it is very common. What I do try, I try to get companies to think about the legal ramifications of keeping data too long.
Yeah.
And if I can get a lawyer involved, from their company, to help them understand that if you have the data, whether it's on backup tapes or in primary storage, if you have the data, at least in the US, I'm not that familiar with laws in other countries, but if you have it, you are legally obligated to provide it in a discovery case. Right?
Yeah, I fought that fight many, many times. So
yeah, and so it's a really bad idea to keep primary data for longer than you need, and also to keep backups for longer than you really need operationally. So it's a good thing to do on behalf of the company, but they either like the idea or they don't.
Yeah, especially regulated data too. I mean, when you've got PCI data that goes back 10 or 15 years, what are you thinking?
Right.
Or HIPAA, even worse, unless there's a requirement to keep it 21.
Exactly.
But
but honestly, the most of the conversations I'm talking about today do have to do with these cybersecurity aspects, right?
yeah,
Because backup systems have gone ignored for so long that we talked about the separating of the data, right? By the way, that NFS exploit that you talked about earlier, is that
hmm
if it's a Windows box that is using NFS, you can exploit that NFS, or is it a
yeah,
way to exploit just a random Windows box
it's a
that
vulnerability in the code itself. So if you're using
okay, so if
Yeah,
you're
the
using
NFS
NFS, right?
services. Yeah, it's the
Yeah,
NFS
okay.
services that are weak.
Yeah, because that's a very common way, by the way, to store backups is to have a box. You export it via NFS
yeah,
to the backup server,
hmm
and so that's the big concern that I have today um, is how are they, number one, just making sure you have any copy, right? Basically the equivalent of the tape copy, because if you have a typical on-prem infrastructure, the best thing you can do today, as far as I can tell, is to have a copy of that data, and most of them can do this. Put a copy of that data in like Amazon S3 and turn on the
right,
immutable option, right? It's a horrible place to have it if and when you actually get an attack, because you'll have to get that back, and the system that copied it up to the cloud, it thinks of that as like an archive, like an old copy, right? They don't think of
hmm
it as an active thing that they're going to use to recover. Um, the and yeah, I do work for a company that this is the problem that we solve for people, that we try to tell them, just the phrase I like to use is get out of the backup business and just get into the recovery business. And it's like, solve these cybersecurity challenges by just having someone else that specializes in that do all of that for you, right? And that the second challenge that they have, if they have it in the cloud, is that what is your recovery option, right? I talked about the difficulty of if it's not designed to do that. The way we work, when we restore an on-prem server, like a VMware server, we often are faster than a typical on-prem appliance. So the question is, what's your recovery option? Protect the data, but then make sure that you've done it in a way that you can recover the data quickly in the event of an attack or
yeah.
a disaster.
No, that makes
So,
Great.
sense.
yeah, something. Sorry, Zach, I don't want to hijack, but it's a question I have that we see a lot when Mike and I are taking clients through a cybersecurity framework like PCI is a good one, NIST CSF or even CIS controls, and they talk about specifically encrypting backups.
Yeah.
How important do you see that in what you do from an online perspective? I mean, are you seeing clients like want to bring their own keys and things like that to secure those backups, or
Yeah. Absolutely. So at this point, again, go back 10 years ago, encrypting backups was a novelty. Today, I think it's table stakes. So it's both from I'd say it's more about compliance and about protecting your company from embarrassment. So if your backups are encrypted and and let's say it's tapes, and the tapes get stolen, you don't have to tell anybody. If your backups were unencrypted, then you have to notify the world that some very personal information just got stolen and it could possibly be read, right? The same is true of the stuff that's stored on disk or the cloud. You've got to encrypt it in such a way that the hackers aren't going to be able to get it. It's also about like we make sure to separate the data from the metadata. We also do deduplication. I don't know how familiar you guys are, your listeners are with that, but this is the idea of slicing up the data into little pieces and running that through a cryptographic hashing algorithm to get a value, and then we identify that chunk of data is new or not new, and we use that to drop by an order of magnitude or two the amount of data that has to be transferred in the backup. And so there's metadata that is needed to assemble all those little bits together into a file, and then there's metadata needed to assemble all the files into a server, storing that data separately and encrypting that as well, right? The bring your own key thing is, I think, absolutely crucial, right? If a question to ask a vendor is there any way at your company, and hopefully they will be honest with an answer, is there any way at your company that a privileged person with a privileged account can get access to my data? And because it's not so much not trusting that company as much, and again, I'm preaching to the choir here, it's if there's an account that can be used to do that, then that account could be compromised and used to do that, right? So that's, I think, to bring your own keys and all of that, if the vendor isn't ever able to access your data, that's really the question, that's the thing that you want. And of course that means that, you need to manage your keys and your passwords. And if you lose all of them, you might be in a world of hurt.
With great power comes great responsibility, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We're coming up on time here, Curtis, but we talked about a couple things. You'd mentioned a couple things that people need to be on the lookout for, their recovery options, speed to recovery, making sure they have the ability to manage their keys, and that the organization that they're backing up with can't actually access the data themselves. Are there any other tips you would give for buyers or people in the market looking for a backup and recovery solution? Is there anything else they should be looking for that maybe we haven't touched on yet?
I think we've covered the basics. I mean, it's hard to cover, all of the things I'm advising customers right now in a call of this length, but I think we've covered. I think the biggest concern I have are people that have Windows-based backup servers. And again, it's not that Windows is either more or less secure than say Linux or VMware. That there are clearly attacks and vulnerabilities and exploits that are happening with those.
Curtis, it's okay to badmouth Windows on this show.
Yeah.
We know how unbelievably crap fest it is.
My primary problem with it is that it is the number one attack vector for ransomware, right? And I just think it's a bad idea to have that as your primary backup server. And unfortunately, that's the two biggest companies in the backup space. That is what they're doing. They do both offer Linux-based media servers and other ways to store their data. So at least look at that option. If you're going to stay with a Windows-based backup server, look at storing the data, the data itself, in something other than Windows, also maybe the cloud. But by the way, one thing you mentioned my books. My most recent book, Modern Data Protection, you can actually get it free by going to druva.com/ebook. And then, you get a free copy of my latest O'Reilly book.
We get a bunch of sales calls.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Well,
so the greatest takeaway for today is don't use WordPress backup on a Microsoft Windows system. Right?
That's what I was going to say. You combine those two together and everything just burns to the ground. Well, hey, thank you, Curtis, for joining us today. Any other final words of wisdom, or if you had to leave the audience with one thing to remember, anything else you would say?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to sound like to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but I do think that the easiest way to solve all these cybersecurity problems is to use a service like Druva to put all of those problems in the hands of someone who actually wants to solve those problems, and to also make sure that you have an air-gapped copy that, it's just all of our copies are air-gapped and immutable. You don't have to do anything special. So I'd say that'd be my final words.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, W. Curtis Preston here. They call him Mr. Backup. Curtis, we thank you so much for joining us on the show. You mentioned druva.com. That's druva.com/ebook is where people can find your ebook. How else can they reach out to you? I know you have a podcast. What's your
Absolutely.
podcast URL?
So at WC Preston is Twitter. My podcast name is Restore It All. So if you go to backupcentral.com, you can find episodes and all that.
Great. Backupcentral.com. We'll put these links in the show notes as well. Well, thank you again so much. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the Cyber Rants podcast. If you like the podcast, subscribe, share it, rate it, help us get the word out there. Cybersecurity is critical to the well-being of our nation and really the backbone of our economy, our way of life, and we need to get this information out there. So thank you for listening. Let us know what you want to hear about on future episodes, and we'll see you next time.
Pick up your copy of the Cyber Rants book on Amazon today. And if you're looking to take your cybersecurity program to the next level, visit us online at www.silentsector.com. Join us next time for another edition of the Cyber Rants podcast.